The city of Samaria was silent except for the cries of hunger that rose from within its broken walls. The Syrian army had surrounded it for months, cutting off every road, every gate, every stream of water that once gave life. Inside, famine had become the ruler, and despair its prophet. The market stalls that once overflowed with fruit and grain now sold nothing but shadows. Mothers held their children close, not for warmth, but to guard them from the madness that famine breeds. The people looked to the heavens, but no rain came. The streets reeked of death and desperation, and even the palace was not spared. The king tore his robe in anguish, revealing sackcloth beneath, a sign of grief that even royalty could not hide from suffering. Each day brought stories darker than the last. A donkey's head was sold for a fortune, and a handful of bird droppings became a delicacy among the dying. Hunger drove people to madness, their eyes hollow, their minds empty. The cries of children pierced the air, and the strong devoured the weak. At the city gate, two women once made an unthinkable agreement, to cook their sons and eat them, one after another, that they might survive another day. But when one mother hid her child, the other cried out to the king for justice. Her words, soaked with horror, struck the city like thunder. The king's heart broke, and he swore vengeance, not on the famine, but on the prophet Elisha, whom he blamed for the curse that had fallen upon them. The guards searched the streets, torches flickering against the cracked walls as they hunted for Elisha. The prophet, however, sat calmly in his house, surrounded by the elders of the land. His eyes were steady, untouched by fear. When the king's messenger approached, Elisha spoke before he could enter. "This son of a murderer has sent to take my head," he said quietly. "But hear the word of the Lord. Tomorrow, about this time, a measure of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, in the gate of Samaria." The elders exchanged bewildered glances. The prophecy sounded impossible, a promise of abundance when the people could barely find air to breathe. Yet Elisha spoke it with such certainty that even the stones seemed to listen. The king himself arrived soon after, his face gaunt, his robe torn, his faith hanging by a thread. He stared at the prophet with eyes that burned with anger and pain. "Behold, this evil is of the Lord. Why should I wait for him any longer?" he said bitterly. Elisha did not rise. He only looked at him and repeated the promise. "By this time tomorrow," he said, "food will return to your gates, and plenty will flow where famine now reigns." At this, one of the king's officers laughed, a cruel, hopeless laugh that echoed through the room. "If the Lord himself should make windows in heaven, could this thing be?" he mocked. Elisha's gaze turned toward him, steady and unshaken. "You shall see it with your eyes," he said, "but you shall not eat thereof." The room fell silent, and the king left without another word. Night fell over Samaria, heavy and cruel. The wind carried no comfort, only the scent of dry dust and dying hopes. Inside the walls, the people huddled in darkness, clinging to whatever faith remained. Beyond the gates, the Syrian camp lay still, its fires glowing faintly against the black sky. Soldiers feasted, unaware that their time was nearly over. And between those two worlds, the starving city and the satisfied enemy, Four lepers sat in the shadows outside the gate. Their bodies were broken, their skin scarred and pale. No one called their names, no one brought them food. They were the forgotten ones, cast out by the city they once called home, left to die between death and despair. Yet before dawn, something in their hearts began to stir, something that would change the fate of all Samaria. Outside the gate of Samaria, the night was colder than usual. The 4 lepers sat in silence, their bodies weak from hunger, their souls heavier than the air around them. They were men once known in the city, but now only whispers of what they used to be. Their skin bore the marks of disease, their faces hidden beneath torn cloths, their hands trembling with both pain and emptiness. The world had forgotten them long before the famine began. They had no family left, no home to return to, no hope to hold on to. The city they once loved had shut its gates against them, and the Syrians who camped beyond the valley would have no mercy on diseased beggars. Between those two worlds, they waited not for rescue, but for death. One of them, Shalem, the eldest, gazed toward the dark outline of the city wall. "They suffer in there as we do," he muttered. His voice cracked with thirst. "The cries of mothers haunt even the wind. We are cursed, but so are they." Joah, sitting beside him, pulled his tattered robe tighter. "At least they die among their own," he said bitterly. "We die alone." The others said nothing. Words felt useless when there was nothing left to believe in. As the moon climbed higher, the stillness around them became unbearable. Hunger gnawed like fire. Eliab, the youngest, tried to remember the taste of bread. "I can still smell it," he whispered, "when my mother baked in the mornings." His voice broke, and he turned away, ashamed of his tears. Abner, the most fearful among them, stared toward the Syrian camp where faint torches flickered. "There is food there," he said softly. The others followed his gaze. "Yes," Joah replied, "and swords and death." Silence fell again, broken only by the sound of the wind brushing over the barren ground. Then Shalem spoke, his voice steady but hollow. "Why sit we here until we die?" The others turned to him. "If we say, 'We will enter the city,' there is famine in the city, and we shall die there. If we sit here, we die also. Now therefore come, let us go to the camp of the Syrians. If they spare us, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall but die." His words hung in the air like a challenge to fate. For a long time no one answered. Abner shook his head. "You would walk into the arms of our enemies?" he asked. "We are lepers. Even if they spare our lives, we are filth to them." Shalem looked up at the stars. "Then let them see our filth," he said quietly. "Death is death, but at least we will meet it standing." The night deepened. In the distance, the Syrian camp shimmered faintly under the moonlight. Tents spread like white stones across the valley, horses tied, weapons glinting faintly near the fires. The lepers rose slowly, their legs trembling, their bodies frail. Every movement brought pain, but their decision had been made. Without another word, they began to walk. Their steps were unsteady, but determined. The sand shifted under their feet, whispering with each step. The world seemed to hold its breath as they moved through the valley. Their shadows stretched long under the moon, for broken figures walking toward the army that had crushed their nation. Abner kept glancing back at the city gate, as though expecting it to open and call them home. But the gate remained closed, silent as stone. Joah whispered, "If the Syrians see us, they'll shoot before we can speak." Shalem replied, "Then let us die speaking." Eliab clutched the edge of his robe, his heart pounding. "Maybe God will see us," he said softly. The others didn't respond, but deep within, the thought stirred something fragile, something like faith that had long been buried under fear. As they approached the camp, an uncanny stillness greeted them. No guards shouted, no horses neighed, no swords clanged. The torches still burned, but the camp was silent, as if frozen in time. Shalem raised his hand to stop the group. "Something's wrong," he whispered. They stood motionless, listening. The wind carried only the faint creak of tents and the rustle of fabric. Joah took a cautious step forward. "They're asleep," he said. But when they reached the first tent, what they found made their hearts pound. Pots of food still warm, bread half-eaten, silver scattered on the ground, and no soldier in sight. They exchanged startled looks. Eliab's eyes widened. "They fled," he said. Abner, still trembling, lifted a piece of meat to his mouth and took a desperate bite. Tears filled his eyes as the taste of life returned to his tongue. The lepers rushed from tent to tent, calling out softly, half expecting someone to answer. But there was no one. The Syrians had vanished, leaving behind their food, gold, silver, horses, and tents. The camp that once threatened Israel now stood abandoned, overflowing with everything Samaria had lost. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the 4 lepers sat surrounded by food, wine, and treasure. They ate until their hunger turned to laughter. The fear that once ruled their hearts melted into disbelief. Eliab lifted a gold cup and stared at his reflection. "We are rich," he said in wonder. "We are alive." Shalem looked at him and smiled weakly. "Alive, yes, but what now?" Joah began gathering silver and hiding it beneath the sand. "We keep it," he said. "No one would believe us anyway. Let the city starve. They cast us out." Abner hesitated but followed his lead. Only Eliab looked uneasy. "This is a day of good news," he said quietly, "and we do not well if we keep silent." His words cut through their greed like a blade. Shalem looked toward the distant walls of Samaria, faint in the morning haze. "If we delay," Eliab continued, "some evil will find us. Let us go and tell the king's house." The others stared at him, torn between fear and conscience. Then Shalem nodded slowly. "You are right," he said. "We were cast out to die, but maybe we were sent to live. Not for ourselves, but for them." They rose, gathering what little strength they had left. The valley that once seemed the path to death now led them back toward life. As they began the walk back to the city, their shadows stretched across the sand like living proof that even the lowest and most forgotten can become the bearers of salvation. The 4 lepers trudged slowly through the dust, the first rays of dawn breaking across the valley. Behind them lay the empty Syrian camp, silent as a graveyard but filled with abundance. Before them, the gates of Samaria loomed high and cold, the same gates that had once cast them out like refuse. The memory stung. Shalem stopped, his gaze fixed on the stone walls. "They will not open for us," he said quietly. "They never did." Joah, his voice tired but calm, replied, "We are not going to beg for bread this time. We bring news, life itself." Eliab, still young and restless, looked between the others. "If they listen, the people will live. If they don't—" His voice trailed off. Abner shivered, the morning air chilling his frail body. "They will think we lie. Who would believe that the Syrians ran away?" Shalem turned to face them, his face lined with resolve. "We have seen what no one else has seen. God has done what no man could do. Whether they believe or not, we must tell them." And with that, they continued toward the city gate, the outcasts returning as bearers of salvation. At the gate, the guards watched their approach with suspicion. They were gaunt men, weary from hunger, their eyes sunken but still sharp. When they saw the lepers, they raised their spears. "Stay back," one of them shouted. "You are unclean." Shalem lifted his trembling hands in peace. "We mean no harm," he said. "We bring news, good news." The guards exchanged doubtful glances. Joah stepped forward. "The Syrians are gone," he said. "Their camp is empty. Food, silver, horses, all left behind. There is no one there." The guards laughed bitterly. "Do you take us for fools?" one sneered. "The Syrians do not flee from lepers." Abner's voice shook as he spoke. "We have eaten their food. We have seen with our eyes. Send men and see for yourselves before the day is gone." The guards hesitated. Hunger gnawed at them too. They looked toward the valley, where faint columns of smoke still rose from the Syrian camp. At last, one guard turned to another. "If there is even a chance this is true," he said, "we must tell the king." The gate creaked as a messenger was sent through the streets, running breathlessly toward the palace. The king sat in his hall, the air thick with the smell of fear and decay. His counselors murmured around him, their faces grim. When the messenger burst in, he fell to his knees. "My lord," he gasped, "the lepers outside the gate bring word. They say the Syrians have fled and left their camp full of food and treasure." The room erupted in disbelief. The king's face hardened. "It is a trick," he said. "The Syrians know we are hungry. They have gone to hide themselves in the field, saying, 'When they come out of the city, we shall take them alive and enter it.'" The murmurs grew louder. "My lord speaks wisely," one counselor said. "The enemy knows our weakness." But another, an old officer whose faith had not yet died, stepped forward. "Let some take 5 of the horses that remain," he suggested. "They are as good as dead with hunger, but let them go and see." The king paused, weighing the risk. At last he nodded. "Send men to spy," he ordered. "If it is a trap, we lose nothing. If it is true—" He could not bring himself to finish the thought. 2 chariots rattled out of the gate, their wheels creaking, their horses weak but willing. The lepers watched from a distance as the scouts rode off toward the valley. Dust rose behind them as they disappeared into the horizon. The men of the city gathered at the walls, whispering, waiting, praying that the impossible might somehow be true. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and the heat shimmered across the plains. Finally, the watchman on the wall cried out, "They return!" The scouts came galloping back, their voices shouting before they even reached the gate. "It is true," they cried. "The Syrians are fled. The whole way is full of garments and vessels they cast away in their haste." The words spread like fire through dry grass. Shouts turned to laughter, and laughter to tears. The gates that had been shut in fear for so long now burst open with hope. Men, women, and children poured out, racing toward the valley, toward life, toward food. The sound of joy replaced the silence of despair. The lepers stood aside as the flood of people passed them. The same people who once spat at them, cursed them, and drove them out. Now none noticed them. All were too busy rushing to the camp of abundance. Shalem watched the crowd and whispered, "It was never about us." Eliab smiled faintly, the morning light glinting on his scarred face. "Still," he said, "God used us." At the gate, the officer who had mocked Elisha's prophecy was assigned to control the people. He stood tall, scoffing at the madness of the hungry crowd. But as the multitude surged forward, desperate to reach the camp, they trampled him beneath their feet. He saw the fulfillment of the prophecy, food in plenty, silver and gold, but he did not taste of it, just as the prophet had said. By evening, the markets of Samaria overflowed once more. Flour and barley were sold for a shekel, just as Elisha had promised. The cries of hunger turned into laughter and song. And far from the noise, the 4 lepers sat on a hill overlooking the city. They shared what was left of their meal, the sun sinking behind them in peace. "We were cast out," Joah said quietly. "Yet God remembered us first." Shalem nodded, his eyes distant but full of gratitude. "When men forgot us," he said, "He did not." That night, as the stars shone above Samaria, the story of the 4 lepers became a living lesson, that even in the darkest famine, faith can rise from the dust, and salvation can come through the hands of the most broken. The valley that once belonged to fear now shimmered with life. The tents of the Syrians stood open, their silken curtains swaying in the morning wind. Pots of food still smoked over dying fires, garments lay scattered like fallen leaves, and gold glinted in the sand. What had been the enemy's pride became the outcast's provision. No soldier remained, no commander shouted orders, no sound of battle echoed. Only the faint whisper of divine intervention. The 4 lepers, who had first stumbled upon the miracle, now watched as the people of Samaria rushed like a river down the hillsides. The city gates that once closed them out now released thousands. Hunger had turned to madness, and madness into celebration. The famine was broken, and yet none truly understood how. Far away, in the silence that still hung over the Syrian camp, the unseen story of their flight lingered. In the dead of night, The Lord had made the Syrians hear a sound like no other, the thunder of horses, the rumble of chariots, the march of a mighty host. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, a sound that filled the valleys and rolled across the mountains like a storm. The king of Israel has hired the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to come upon us, they cried in terror. Panic seized the army. Soldiers dropped their weapons, commanders forgot their ranks, and tents were abandoned in chaos. They fled for their lives, leaving behind their treasures, their beasts, their very names. The miracle had not come through sword or strength, but through the unseen power of heaven's command. Back at the city, the king stood atop the wall, looking out over the valley where his people swarmed among the tents. His heart trembled between fear and awe. Only a day before, he had accused the prophet of bringing ruin. Now the prophecy had come true to the letter. Fine flour and barley-filled baskets again, sold for a price so small it mocked the famine that had once reigned. The people laughed, cried, and shouted praises. Mothers fed their children. Fathers wept as they ate for the first time in weeks. The streets that once echoed with groans now rang with songs. But not all hearts rejoiced. The officer who had mocked Elisha stood at the gate, struggling to keep order as the flood of people pressed outward. He shouted commands, but no one listened. In the chaos, the crowd surged forward, trampling him underfoot. He fell, crushed by the very miracle he doubted. And as life left him, Elisha's words came true. You shall see it with your eyes, but you shall not eat thereof. The prophecy was complete, every word fulfilled. As the city feasted, the 4 lepers lingered apart, watching the joy from a distance. Shalem sat on a rock, the sunset painting his scarred face in gold. Do you think they will remember us? Eliab asked softly. Joash shook his head. They have food again. They will not remember hunger, nor those who ended it. Abner stared at the city gates where the officer's body had been carried away. Maybe it's better that way, he murmured. We were never meant to be heroes. Shalem smiled faintly. No, he said, but we were meant to obey. When we moved, God moved. His words settled over them like a quiet revelation. They were not warriors, prophets, or kings, only broken men who dared to take a step when all others stood still. The miracle had not started in the palace, nor in the temple, but in the hearts of the outcasts who refused to surrender to despair. That night, the campfires of Samaria burned bright again. Families sat together, the air thick with laughter and the smell of roasted grain. Children danced in the streets, their bellies full, their faces glowing with life. In the prophet's house, Elisha prayed in silence, thanking the Almighty for his mercy and power. The siege had been lifted, the famine broken, the people saved, not by armies or wealth, but by faith and divine timing. Far beyond the city, the 4 lepers rested beneath the stars. The wind carried the faint echo of celebration to where they sat. Eliab looked toward the heavens. We were dying, he whispered, but he used us to bring life. Shalem nodded slowly. It is always the dying who see what the living ignore, he said. We thought we were forsaken, but we were chosen. The night deepened, and peace settled over the land. The same God who had silenced an army and fed a city watched over the 4 men who had once been forgotten. In their weakness, he had revealed his strength. In their shame, he had written his glory. And though their names would fade from memory, their story would live. A reminder that faith can rise from the dust, and miracles often walk in the footsteps of those the world calls unclean. Morning broke over Samaria with the sound of life again. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the air that once smelled of decay now carried the scent of baked bread. People filled the streets, their faces alive with relief and joy. The long nightmare was over. The famine that had turned families against each other was now only a memory. In the midst of the celebration, 4 figures stood apart from the crowd. Shalem, Joah, Abner, and Eliab watched quietly from the outskirts, their torn garments fluttering in the wind. No one greeted them, no one offered them food or thanks, yet they did not mind. Their hearts were full, for they knew the truth. The deliverance of Samaria began with them. Shalem leaned on his staff, his voice calm but heavy with reflection. The people rejoice, but they do not know the path we walked to bring this. Joah nodded. It is better they never know, he said. They would never believe that the city's salvation began with 4 dying men. Eliab smiled faintly. It does not matter who carried the news, he said. Only that the news was carried. Their eyes followed the crowd, and for the first time in years, they felt peace. Not the peace of comfort, but the peace of purpose. The king sat on his throne again, his robe restored, his crown polished though his heart was still uncertain. Before him stood the prophet Elisha, calm and unmoved by the royal grandeur around him. The king bowed his head, unable to meet the prophet's eyes. Truly, the word of the Lord is true, he said. We doubted, and yet the heavens opened without a sword being drawn. Elisha spoke softly. The Lord does not need armies to fight his battles. He only seeks those willing to believe. The king sighed deeply. And the lepers? He asked. What shall become of them? Elisha lifted his gaze. They were the messengers of life. Yet the world often forgets its messengers once the message is heard. His tone carried neither anger nor sorrow, only truth. Let their names be known among the people, for the Lord used them as vessels of deliverance. The king nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. The affairs of state would soon bury the memory of the 4 men who had changed the fate of his nation. The 4 lepers wandered to the edge of the valley where the Syrian camp still lay scattered. They filled sacks with what they could: bread, flour, and a few pieces of silver. We should return to the wilderness, Abner said, looking uneasy. Even with food in the city, they will not let us dwell among them. Joah agreed. The walls that once kept famine out will now keep us out again. Nothing changes for men like us. Eliab looked toward the city, his eyes filled with quiet hope. Maybe one thing has changed, he said. We have seen that God remembers even the forgotten. If he could use us once, he can keep us wherever we go. Shalem turned his face toward the horizon. Then we go with peace, he said. We have done what was required. They shouldered their burdens and began to walk, their steps slow but steady. The sun shone on them, and though they had no home, they carried something greater, the memory of a miracle that no man could erase. In the city, the people gathered at the gates to tell the story again and again. The tale spread like fire, how the Syrians had fled in terror, how abundance had returned overnight, and how Elisha's prophecy was fulfilled exactly as spoken. Yet as the story traveled, the lepers' part began to fade. Some said it was the king's scouts who found the camp. Others claimed an angel had appeared. Few mentioned the 4 men whose courage had set it all in motion. But truth does not vanish even when voices forget it. It lingers quietly in the hearts of those who lived it. A group of children played near the city wall that evening, tossing crumbs of bread into the air and laughing. An old woman sitting nearby watched them and smiled faintly. Eat, children, she said softly. You eat today because 4 lepers dared to walk where others would not. Her words drifted into the air and were carried by the wind, a whisper of remembrance that time could not silence. As night fell, Elisha stood outside the city, his eyes fixed on the stars. The wind stirred his mantle, and his heart was still before the Lord. You lift the lowly, he murmured, and bring food to the hungry through hands that men despise. His prayer faded into the darkness, but the heavens heard. Far away, under the same stars, the 4 lepers sat by a fire on the edge of the wilderness. The flames danced across their worn faces, lighting the lines of pain and peace alike. They shared the bread they had gathered, their laughter soft and tired. Abner looked up. Do you think the city will remember us? He asked. Shalem smiled. Perhaps not, he said. But heaven remembers. Eliab stirred the embers with a stick and added quietly, "That is enough." The others nodded. They had no riches, no home, no fame. Yet they had walked with faith when others stood still. They had carried the good news, and that was their glory. The fire burned low as the stars wheeled silently above them. The famine was gone, the prophecy fulfilled, and the lepers, once outcasts, had become instruments of divine mercy. Their story was no longer one of disease and despair, but of courage, faith, and redemption. And though their names would fade from history's lips, their footsteps would echo forever in the valley where God turned death into life through the most unlikely of men. Dawn spread softly across Samaria, painting the rooftops gold. The city that had once been wrapped in the stench of death now breathed again. Children's laughter filled the alleys. Merchants reopened their stalls, and the sound of grinding grain replaced the cries of hunger. The people moved like those waking from a long, terrible dream. Yet beneath the joy, a quiet reverence lingered, an awareness that something beyond human strength had happened. Elisha stood on a terrace overlooking the city. The breeze carried the smell of baked bread and roasted meat, the proof of prophecy fulfilled. His eyes glimmered, not with pride, but gratitude. The Lord had kept his word. The siege had ended without a battle. No warrior's blade had brought this victory. It was heaven that had moved. Behind him, his servant Gehazi approached quietly. "My master," he said, "the people feast and rejoice. The king himself gives thanks in the temple. Your word has come to pass." Elisha's gaze did not shift. "It is not my word," he replied softly. "It is the word of the Lord, and every word he speaks finds its day." In the royal court, the king sat surrounded by abundance. Tables filled with bread, figs, and grain. The same hands that once tore his robe in despair now lifted food in praise. Yet even as he smiled, his eyes were shadowed. The memory of his disbelief haunted him. He remembered the moment he had accused the prophet, the bitterness in his own voice when he had said, "Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" He looked across the table at the officer who once mocked Elisha, or rather, at the empty seat that now bore his memory. The man had seen the miracle with his own eyes but died in the crowd's frenzy. The king bowed his head. "The word of the Lord is fire," he whispered. "It consumes doubt as swiftly as it feeds faith." He raised his cup and said to his attendants, "Let the story of this day be told from generation to generation, that Israel may know the Lord is faithful." At the edge of the city, where the dust of famine still clung to the earth, the 4 lepers watched from afar. They saw the city feasting, heard the echoes of joy, and felt the peace of fulfillment. "The prophecy has ended," Joah said. "The people live again." Shalem nodded. "And we have seen both death and life," he said. Abner turned to him, frowning. "Do you think we were chosen for this?" Shalem looked out toward the horizon. "No man chooses leprosy, Abner, but God chooses the vessel that will move when others remain still." Eliab smiled faintly, staring at the clouds. "Perhaps that is what faith is, walking toward the unknown when everything says stay." His words hung in the air, simple yet eternal. For though they were outcasts, they understood something the city never would. Miracles do not wait for perfect men. They find willing hearts. As evening came, the lepers made their way to the valley once more. The Syrian tents stood empty, their fires long gone, but the place still shimmered with unseen holiness. The wind that moved through the valley carried a quiet whisper, as though the earth itself remembered the sound of that divine thunder. The invisible army that had driven fear into the hearts of men. They sat together in silence. Joah gathered a few stones and built a small pile, a simple altar of remembrance. "This is where the Lord made his power known," he said. "We should not forget." Shalem placed his hand upon the stones. "Nor will he forget," he said, "for this ground bears the print of his mercy." The setting sun cast long shadows over the valley, touching the stones with a crimson glow. It was not the monument of kings or prophets, but of lepers, men who had been rejected by the world and yet chosen by God to fulfill his promise. Night settled once more over Samaria. The city was quiet, filled with peace. In the prophet's home, Elisha prayed for his people, his voice soft and steady. "You have done what no man could do," he whispered. "You have turned despair into hope and shame into salvation. May Israel never forget that your mercy is stronger than famine, your power greater than armies." Beyond the city walls, the four lepers lay near their fire beneath a blanket of stars. The flames flickered low, and the night air grew cool. They spoke no more, for words had finished their purpose. Their story had been written not on scrolls, but in the hearts of men. Shalem closed his eyes, the last warmth of the fire brushing his face. "We began as the dying," he murmured, "but we end as the living." Joah smiled. "Then let this night be our peace." The wind rustled softly through the valley, and the stars above shone brighter than before, silent witnesses to a miracle born of faith and courage. The prophecy had come full circle. The famine was broken, the promise fulfilled, and the name of the Lord exalted above all fear. From the palace to the leper's camp, the truth remained. When God speaks, even despair must bow. And in that truth lay the eternal fulfillment, that from the weakest hands can flow the greatest deliverance, and from the darkest night can rise the dawn of mercy everlasting.